First tonight, more than 40 people are reported to have been killed in an Israeli airstrike on a UN school in central Gaza, sheltering displaced people. Israel says it contained a Hamas compound with some 20 to 30 fighters. Footage showed destroyed classrooms and dead bodies wrapped in shrouds at a morgue in Nusrat. The Israeli army insists it took steps to reduce the risk of harming civilians, but Hamas described it as a massacre. Well, 8 months after it carried out the attack of October the 7th in Israel, Hamas still has at least 9,000 to 12,000 fighters, according to US officials, down from some 20,000 to 25,000. Israel has now, of course, launched a new operation in the center of Gaza. And following talks about that proposed Gaza ceasefire and the release of hostages agreement involving a number of countries, the UK, France, Germany, Spain and the US are among 17 countries urging Hamas and Israel to accept the latest proposal. The White House says they fully support the movement towards the ceasefire and hostage release deal, and they call on Hamas and Israel to close that agreement and do whatever compromises are necessary to both sides. Well, for more, let's cross live to Tel Aviv and speak with Arise special correspondent Carl Bostic. Good to see you, Carl. What are the Israelis saying about that airstrike? What's the latest update?
Well, what's really interesting, Charles, is that the Israeli military spokesperson said they actually were not initially aware of any civilians being harmed at all, that they were taking great caution to reduce and minimize any civilian casualties. Another report out of the U.S. Says that the kind of munitions or bombs that that Israel used were the smallest type of possible bombs to use, called the GBU-39 bomb. It's no more than like a 40-pound bomb, Charles, but it's deadly because it can penetrate concrete. It's the kind of explosive device that was used in Rafah last month, where they were targeting Hamas militants, but the secondary explosion set the tents on fire, killing dozens of people. So the Israeli military, they're simply saying they've taken extreme caution. They're saying that they used small munitions. But what this underlines is this, Charles, is one of two things. I mean, no matter how precise you are, Charles, with this kind of strike, even though they had intelligence that's just being used as a command and control center by Hamas, that the people they were targeting were people who participated in the October 7th attack, the slaughter, October 7th. Israel is saying that they were acting with precise intelligence, but that's really doesn't really mean much if you've got thousands of people displaced taking shelter in this compound. This is 1:30 in the morning, Charles, when this happened. So this, unfortunately, Charles, unless it's a ceasefire pause, this kind of tragedy is going to repeat itself over and over again for what could become a very long, hot summer.
Indeed, Carl, but it's interesting that the head of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees says Israel gave no warning before that airstrike. I mean, what are the Israelis saying about that claim? Have they said anything?
Charles, there are claims and counterclaims, because the Israelis are saying that they actually called off this strike twice because of their concerns about incurring civilian tragedy. So that's their kind of curt response to this kind of thing, that it was actually called off twice. But again, as I just mentioned a moment ago, this also really shows really a kaleidoscope of tragedy that's really unfolding every day, Charles. Just when people are being told to leave Rafah, about 1 million or so to leave Rafah, hundreds of thousands are now leaving Rafah, moving north in west of Gaza. They're taking shelter, but the dilemma is they're taking shelter in a place where they know they may be attacked and killed.
And, I mean, Carl, are there people in Israel where you are whose voices are loud enough saying that Israel is violating international laws and has crossed all red lines in this war?
Well, if those are voices and loud voices, as you say, those those voices are being overwhelmed by louder cries for a ceasefire, not because of what's happening in Gaza, but because they want the hostages brought home. Because the only reports we're getting about hostages are dead bodies being recovered or reported. So the rallies that are being held are to bring the hostages home. And you asked me the other night about possibly even raiding to rescue American Israeli hostages. We don't know how many are still alive, Charles, and the ones that are alive, a certain core of them are being used as human shields to protect the Hamas leaders who are remaining in Gaza. But no, Charles, those voices are not loud enough to sway the government. If anything, it's more swayed by public opinion, because after 8 months of war, you still have more than 120 hostages to account for.
And just following up on what you're saying there, Carl, Israel saying there would be no halt in the fighting during this current ceasefire talks. I mean, how might this latest attack and subsequent operations affect those talks?
What's interesting is this, Charles. Really, neither Israel, or at least the Israeli government, or Hamas really has an appetite for a ceasefire, at least as far as the leaders, Netanyahu of Israel and Yahweh Sinwar of Hamas are concerned, because it's in their interest, for reasons of political survival or physical survival, for this war to be prolonged. And what you see going on here is that even though this proposal you mentioned by the White House, that's being supported by these like 16 countries or so, they still are far apart. They've not definitively accepted or rejected that agreement. And the sticking points are basically one or two fundamental ones, because after the first ceasefire, Israel is still leaving the door open to resume the fight. And Hamas wants a permanent end to the fighting. That's one thing. And then secondly, what happens with the day after? That proposal from the White House is kind of vague in saying what happens the day after, leaving the door open for Hamas still to have a role in the governing or operation of Gaza. And for Israel, that's a non-starter. So they're still quite far apart, to be honest. And meanwhile, you're having these kinds of tragedies unfold almost on a weekly basis.
And just briefly, I mean, there are reports suggesting that Hamas are saying that the proposal the Israelis are presenting at those talks is different from the one President Biden put forward. And they're saying that Israel is only prepared to implement the first stage of the proposal, which deals with bringing many of the hostages home from Gaza, while keeping open the option of renewing the fighting afterwards. I mean, what light can you shed on that? Because Hamas are insisting, as you said, on a full end to the war in Gaza and a full withdrawal of Israeli troops.
That's exactly the problem, Charles, as you just summed it up. I mean, the first phase is supposed to be a 6-week ceasefire where you've got elderly, sick, and women returned, while negotiations then continue for a second phase of another 6 weeks. And if those negotiations are progressive enough, in other words, making progress, that 6-week phase could actually be extended to a much longer period. Israel it's not enthusiastic about that, because it wants to be able to have the option of returning to war, returning to campaign after 6 weeks, and that's it. And Hamas is saying that we should still be able to negotiate, but we want a permanent end after the first phase.
It's a fascinating, very worrying development there. But thank you very much indeed, Carl. Thank you for your analysis and for staying there and covering all this for us. Carl Bostic is Arise special correspondent. He was talking to me from the Israeli city of Tel Aviv.